The military does not interrupt a secure command network unless something impossible has just happened. The sharp electronic alert echoed through the secure ballistic monitoring center, cutting across the steady hum of computers that had quietly watched over the installation for years without incident. Every technician looked up at the same instant. A single warning indicator glowed bright red across the central display, something none of the younger analysts had ever seen activate during a normal training day. One operator leaned closer, convinced the system had malfunctioned. Another immediately launched a diagnostic check, while a supervisor walked briskly from his office toward the operations console. No one spoke for several long seconds except for the quiet tapping of keyboards and the soft whir of cooling fans beneath polished equipment racks. A digital map of the surrounding training complex slowly expanded across the largest monitor as a single ballistic trajectory appeared in bright crimson, stretching farther than any scheduled exercise should have allowed. The supervisor folded his arms. Verify every sensor. Fingers moved quickly across multiple workstations. Independent radar data appeared first. Acoustic tracking confirmed it seconds later. Optical monitoring followed with the same result. Every system agreed. One perfectly measured long-range ballistic event had entered a protected evaluation corridor reserved for highly specialized monitoring. Scheduled demonstration? The supervisor asked. Negative. Research testing? Negative. Another technician searched the official range schedule for the afternoon. Echo range has routine precision qualification today. Nothing on the schedule matches this trajectory. The supervisor remained calm, but his eyes never left the glowing red line crossing the digital terrain model. Identify the firing point. Coordinates appeared almost instantly. Echo range. Distance calculations followed. Wind estimates populated automatically. Every new line of data only deepened the mystery. The supervisor quietly reached for a secure telephone while the room settled into an uneasy silence that felt heavier than the alarm itself. Outside the monitoring center, however, nothing suggested history had just begun to unfold. 12 minutes earlier, bright afternoon sunlight stretched across Echo Range, turning distant desert ridges into wavering silhouettes beneath rising heat. Loose gravel crunched beneath military boots while Marines prepared another routine afternoon of long-range instruction. Modern precision rifles rested on carefully adjusted bipods. Spotting scopes reflected flashes of sunlight. Electronic weather stations updated constantly as small range flags fluttered in different directions across the valley. Conversations drifted naturally through the dry air as instructors discussed wind calls, elevation corrections, and ballistic software. Everything felt predictable. Then an old pickup truck rolled quietly into the visitor parking area. The engine shut down. The driver stepped out without hurry. Thomas Walker closed the truck door gently before reaching into the bed and lifting a weathered rifle case that had clearly traveled through many decades of careful ownership. At 84 years old, he moved with steady confidence instead of youthful speed. His faded denim jacket, simple plaid shirt, worn work boots, and calm blue eyes attracted little attention at first. It was the rifle case that changed everything. Thomas walked toward an empty firing position, greeting no one because no introduction seemed necessary to him. He laid the case on the wooden bench, released two old metal latches, and slowly opened the lid. Resting inside was a bolt-action rifle unlike every modern platform surrounding it. Its faded orange stock immediately stood apart against the muted colors of advanced military equipment. Nearby conversations stopped one after another as Marines noticed the unusual firearm. Curious expressions quickly turned into amused smiles. One Marine nudged another with his elbow before quietly laughing. A young Marine sergeant named Ethan Brooks looked directly at the orange rifle, then back at the elderly visitor, unable to hide his disbelief. Thomas paid no attention to the growing audience. Instead, he gently brushed a thin layer of desert dust from the orange stock with the back of two fingers before lifting his eyes toward the distant mountains, where invisible currents of wind had already begun telling a story that no instrument on the range had yet managed to understand. Thomas Walker rested the weathered rifle case gently on the wooden bench, as though placing something precious into familiar hands instead of preparing for another afternoon on a military range. He slowly lifted the old bolt-action rifle from its padded lining. revealing the faded orange stock that immediately caught every eye nearby. Against rows of modern precision rifles finished in subdued military colors, the bright weathered stock looked strangely out of place, almost as though it belonged to another era entirely. A few Marines glanced toward one another before quiet laughter spread across the firing line. The sound was not cruel at first. It carried the easy confidence of young professionals convinced they had already seen everything worth seeing. Sergeant Ethan Brooks looked up from his advanced precision rifle and stared at the old firearm for several seconds before smiling. "That cannot be serious," he said, loud enough for nearby Marines to hear. Several heads turned immediately. One Marine leaned closer, squinting at the orange stock beneath the afternoon sun. "Did somebody paint it with construction equipment paint?" Another joked. A third laughed softly. "Maybe it helps him find it if he drops it." The small group chuckled together while Thomas continued inspecting the rifle with complete patience. He ran a clean cloth across the receiver, checked the bolt with practiced fingers, and quietly placed a worn leather notebook beside the shooting mat. Next came a sharpened pencil and a narrow strip of faded cloth tied to a thin wooden dowel. Brooks noticed the ribbon first. "What is that supposed to do?" Thomas looked up calmly. "Show me the wind." Brooks smiled wider. He pointed toward the sophisticated electronic weather station mounted beside his own rifle. "That machine measures the wind every second." Thomas nodded politely. "It measures the wind where it stands." Brooks folded his arms. "That is exactly what it is designed to do." Thomas looked toward the distant mountains shimmering beneath the desert heat. "The bullet will not stay where the machine stands." Ryan Cole, a young lance corporal serving as spotter that afternoon, quietly lowered his binoculars. Unlike the others, he did not laugh. The old veteran spoke without arrogance or defensiveness. Every answer sounded calm, almost ordinary, as though he had repeated the same lesson countless times before without ever expecting anyone to believe it. Brooks stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "How old is that rifle?" Thomas glanced briefly at the orange stock before answering. "Older than you." A ripple of amusement passed through the nearby Marines. Brooks nodded toward the faded finish. "Looks like it." Thomas smiled faintly. "It has earned every mark." The afternoon breeze drifted across Echo Range, stirring loose dust between the firing positions before slipping into the rocky valley beyond. Small range flags pointed in different directions despite standing only a few hundred yards apart. Heat shimmer danced above the desert floor, bending the distant landscape into wavering layers that challenged even the finest optics. Thomas ignored every conversation around him. Instead, he watched a hawk circling effortlessly above the southern ridge, then shifted his attention toward a patch of dry grass moving almost imperceptibly against a distant hillside. Brooks noticed the veteran studying everything except the target itself. "Looking for something?" he asked. Thomas never took his eyes from the horizon. "No." Brooks raised an eyebrow. "Then what are you watching?" Thomas waited another quiet moment before answering. "The part of the shot that nobody else can see." Ryan followed the veteran's gaze toward the distant ridges, uncertain what he expected to find. All he saw was sunlight, wind, stone, and empty space. Yet something in Thomas Walker's quiet certainty made that empty space suddenly feel full of answers waiting to be discovered. Sergeant Ethan Brooks followed Thomas Walker's quiet gaze toward the shimmering ridgeline, then looked back at the faded orange rifle with an amused smile that spread across his face. "The part of the shot nobody else can see?" he repeated. "That sounds impressive." Several Marines standing nearby chuckled again, encouraged by the confidence in their sergeant's voice. Brooks stepped beside his own precision rifle, a modern platform fitted with advanced optics, laser range calculations, electronic weather integration, and carefully matched ammunition. He rested one hand across the stock with obvious pride. "Everything we do out here is measured," he said. "Wind speed, humidity, air pressure, temperature, density, altitude. Every variable matters." Thomas nodded politely. "It certainly does." Brooks gestured toward the veteran's small cloth ribbon planted beside the firing mat. "And you believe that little piece of cloth can replace all of this?" Thomas smiled gently without looking offended. "No." Brooks raised an eyebrow. "No. It reminds me where to start looking." Ryan Cole quietly watched the exchange while adjusting the focus on his spotting scope. Something about the old veteran continued to feel different from anyone he had ever met. Thomas never argued. He never tried to prove another person wrong. Every answer sounded calm enough to end an argument before it truly began. Brooks looked toward the far end of Echo Range where a tiny steel impact plate rested almost invisibly against the rocky hillside beyond several layers of broken terrain. Even through quality optics, the target appeared little larger than a distant glimmer inside the afternoon heat. "Do you see that plate?" Brooks asked. Thomas followed the direction of his hand. "I do." Brooks smiled confidently. "Just under 4,000 meters." Several Marines exchanged knowing looks. One quietly shook his head before whispering something that drew another round of soft laughter. Brooks turned back toward Thomas. "Nobody comes out here expecting to hit that target during ordinary range hours. We use it for demonstrations, equipment evaluation, and specialized training." Thomas continued studying the distant hills rather than the target itself. Brooks folded his arms. "Would you like to try?" The Marines immediately grew quieter. Ryan lowered his spotting scope. Even the instructors stopped their conversations. Thomas remained silent for several long moments while a warm breeze drifted across the firing line, lifting loose grains of sand before carrying them toward the distant valley. High overhead, a lone hawk rode an invisible current without moving its wings. Finally, Thomas looked back toward Brooks. "If the range allows it." The range safety officer, having listened quietly from several benches away, stepped forward after checking with the lead instructor. "The lane is clear," he said. "One shot only." Brooks nodded. "Fair enough." He extended his hand toward Thomas. "One shot. If you ring that plate, every Marine standing here owes you an apology." Thomas looked at the offered hand before accepting it with a firm but relaxed grip. "And if I do not?" Brooks answered honestly. "Then you admit modern equipment has finally passed old experience." Thomas smiled with quiet kindness rather than disappointment. Experience has never competed against progress. Ryan noticed Brooks hesitate slightly, almost surprised by the answer. The handshake ended, but something had already changed. The laughter had faded completely. Nobody seemed interested in making another joke. As Thomas reached for the weathered orange rifle once more, his fingers paused briefly over a smooth-worn section beneath the faded paint where countless years had polished the wood until it almost reflected the afternoon sunlight. Ryan caught the expression that crossed the old veteran's face for only an instant. It was neither pride nor sadness. It looked more like someone quietly greeting an old memory that had never truly left him. And for reasons he could not explain, Ryan suddenly stopped wondering whether Thomas Walker could make the shot and began wondering what remarkable journey that weathered orange rifle had already completed long before arriving at Echo Range. The handshake ended quietly, yet the atmosphere across Echo Range had changed completely. What had begun as casual amusement now carried the unmistakable weight of expectation. Marines who had been adjusting optics only moments earlier drifted toward the firing lane without being asked. Instructors folded their arms and watched from a respectful distance. Even the range safety officer remained unusually still, allowing silence to settle naturally across the desert. Thomas Walker knelt beside the weathered orange rifle and carefully opened the bolt once more before inspecting the chamber with practiced eyes. Every movement was deliberate, unhurried, and remarkably familiar, as though he had repeated the same sequence thousands of times over a lifetime without ever feeling the need to rush. Sergeant Ethan Brooks watched every motion with growing curiosity. He still believed modern equipment would prove decisive, yet something about the old veteran refused to fit the assumptions he had made only minutes earlier. Thomas reached into the worn leather pouch resting beside his notebook and removed 3 carefully wrapped cartridges. Their brass cases reflected soft flashes of afternoon sunlight before he placed them gently onto the shooting mat. Ryan Cole noticed how naturally Thomas handled each round, almost like someone greeting old friends instead of preparing for a challenge. A young Marine standing nearby finally gathered enough courage to step forward. "Sir," he asked politely, "may I see the rifle?" Thomas smiled and handed it over without hesitation. The Marine expected loose parts, rough maintenance, and worn-out mechanics. Instead, he discovered an action that cycled with remarkable smoothness and craftsmanship that reflected decades of careful attention rather than age alone. As he turned the rifle slightly beneath the sunlight, his thumb brushed across several irregular marks hidden beneath the faded orange finish. "What happened here?" he asked. The small crowd leaned closer. Thomas accepted the rifle back gently and rested one hand over the weathered section of the stock. For a brief instant, his calm blue eyes looked beyond the firing range toward a memory only he could see. The desert disappeared. In its place came the distant rhythm of helicopter rotors fading across another landscape many decades earlier. The smell of rain-soaked earth mixed with hot metal drifted quietly through his thoughts. He remembered an exhausted military armorer placing the damaged rifle onto a wooden bench beneath a single hanging work light. The original walnut stock had survived years of service, but carried deep scars from extreme heat during a forgotten operation. "We could replace it," the armorer had offered while studying the damaged wood. Thomas had slowly shaken his head. "No," the older craftsman smiled knowingly. "You want to keep the memories." Thomas had answered with nothing more than a silent nod. Instead of replacing the stock, the armorer had sealed the scarred wood beneath a durable orange protective finish that remained with the rifle ever since. The memory faded as quietly as it had arrived. Back at Echo Range, Thomas looked toward the curious Marine. "It has traveled farther than most people ever will," he said softly. That was all he offered. No stories, no medals, no explanation. Ryan watched the old veteran close the bolt again before planting the narrow wooden dowel, holding the faded cloth ribbon into the gravel beside the firing position. The thin strip of fabric fluttered gently toward the east, hesitated, then slowly drifted north before settling almost perfectly still. Brooks glanced immediately at his electronic weather station. The numbers updated once again. Another Marine checked his own instrument and received a slightly different reading. Ryan quietly compared both displays before looking back at the simple ribbon dancing almost effortlessly beside Thomas. For the first time since the old pickup truck had arrived that afternoon, Ryan realized the oldest tool on the entire firing line might not have been outdated at all. It might simply have been understood by only one man standing there. Thomas Walker lowered himself onto the shooting mat with the calm precision of someone returning to a familiar conversation rather than preparing for an extraordinary challenge. The weathered orange rifle settled naturally into the curve of his shoulder, while the faded cloth ribbon beside him continued its quiet dance in the shifting desert breeze. Around Echo Range, every conversation had disappeared. The Marines who had laughed only minutes earlier now stood in complete silence, their attention fixed upon the elderly veteran whose confidence seemed untouched by either doubt or expectation. Sergeant Ethan Brooks checked the display on his electronic weather station once more. Wind direction changed again. A second instrument positioned several hundred yards away reported a slightly different value. Brooks frowned and recalculated his firing solution automatically, watching fresh numbers appear across the screen. Ryan Cole compared both instruments through his spotting scope before looking back toward Thomas. The disagreement between the electronic readings suddenly seemed more important than either device itself. Thomas never glanced at any display. Instead, his blue eyes moved slowly across the valley beyond the target. He studied a patch of pale grass bending gently near a distant wash. He watched sunlight flicker across a rocky slope where warm air rose in transparent waves. High above the southern ridge, the same hawk continued gliding without effort, drifting across invisible currents only it seemed able to understand. Thomas quietly smiled as though recognizing an old companion. Brooks noticed the faint expression. "Did you find what you were waiting for?" he asked. Thomas answered without moving his eyes from the landscape. "Not yet." Several more seconds passed. The ribbon fluttered toward the west before relaxing almost completely still. A small swirl of dust crossed the valley floor and dissolved against a cluster of low shrubs. The hawk shifted direction without flapping its wings. Thomas inhaled slowly, then allowed the breath to leave until every muscle in his shoulders relaxed. Ryan watched with growing fascination. He had spent years learning calculations, formulas, and equipment, yet the old veteran appeared to be reading something that existed beyond mathematics alone. Thomas finally settled behind the rifle and looked through the modest optic mounted above the receiver. There were no illuminated reticles, no electronic corrections, no digital displays guiding his decision. Only clear glass, steady hands, and a lifetime of quiet observation separated him from the tiny steel plate resting nearly 4,000 meters away. Brooks lifted his binoculars, and immediately noticed something unexpected. The veteran was not pointing directly at the target. Ryan adjusted his spotting scope twice before realizing Brooks had seen the same thing. "He is holding away from the plate," Ryan whispered. Brooks frowned. "That cannot be correct." Ryan continued studying the sight picture. "Maybe he is not aiming where the target is." Brooks lowered his binoculars slightly. "Then where is he aiming?" Ryan answered almost without thinking. "Where he believes the bullet and the target will finally meet." The word surprised even him. Thomas remained perfectly motionless. The faded ribbon lifted once more, hesitated, then slowly relaxed. Somewhere beyond the visible ridgeline, another unseen current quietly aligned with everything he had been watching since stepping onto the range. His finger rested lightly against the trigger without urgency or hesitation. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the desert itself seemed to wait beside him. Ryan realized he was no longer hoping the old veteran would succeed. He simply wanted to understand what decades of patience could teach a man that no machine had ever learned. At that precise moment, far beyond the firing line and completely unknown to everyone standing there, secure military sensors continued watching the same stretch of empty sky, waiting silently for a single event that would soon awaken an entire chain of command. Thomas Walker did not force the moment. He simply waited until the desert offered it to him. The faded cloth ribbon beside the shooting mat lifted gently toward the west, hesitated for only a heartbeat, then relaxed into near-perfect stillness. Thomas lowered the final fraction of his breath until his shoulders became completely motionless. The weathered orange rifle seemed less like an object resting against him than a familiar extension of decades spent listening instead of rushing. Sergeant Ethan Brooks glanced once more at the electronic weather station mounted beside his own rifle. Fresh numbers appeared across the display as another slight wind shift registered automatically. A second station farther down the firing line reported a different value once. Again, Brooks frowned and quietly recalculated the firing solution, but the changing conditions continued, refusing to settle into agreement. Ryan Cole looked from one display to the other before returning his attention to Thomas. For the first time in his career, he found himself trusting the calm expression on the veteran's face more than the conflicting data surrounding him. Thomas looked through the simple optic one last time. The tiny instrumented steel impact plate shimmered almost invisibly beneath the afternoon heat, distorted by transparent waves rising from the valley floor. Yet the rifle remained pointed slightly away from the center of the target. Ryan adjusted his spotting scope carefully, convinced he had misunderstood what he was seeing. He had not. Brooks noticed the same thing immediately. "He is holding off," Brooks whispered. Ryan answered without lowering the scope. "He is allowing for the landscape." Brooks said nothing more. Even he could no longer explain what he was watching. High above the southern ridge, the hawk that had circled throughout the afternoon quietly shifted direction as another invisible current formed beneath its wings. At almost the same instant, a faint ribbon of dust crossed the valley floor before dissolving into sunlight beyond the distant rocks. Thomas watched neither movement directly. He had already recognized them moments earlier. His finger rested naturally against the trigger. There was no dramatic pause, no visible effort, only one smooth, deliberate motion refined through an entire lifetime of patience. The rifle answered with a single clean report that rolled across the open desert before echoing softly against the distant mountains. Thomas remained perfectly still through the gentle recoil, maintaining his sight picture for another quiet moment before calmly cycling the bolt with effortless precision. Nobody on the firing line spoke. Every Marine searched desperately through binoculars, spotting scopes, and rifle optics toward the nearly invisible target. 5 long seconds passed. Then 7. Then 10. Brooks slowly lowered his binoculars, preparing to accept what he believed had been an impossible attempt. Before he could say a word, a faint metallic sound drifted back across the valley. It arrived softly because of the extraordinary distance, yet every person standing on echo range recognized it instantly. The instrumented impact plate rocked gently beneath the afternoon sunlight before settling back into perfect stillness. Ryan lowered his spotting scope in complete disbelief. Brooks remained frozen where he stood, unable to reconcile the impossible result with every calculation his equipment had predicted only moments earlier. Thomas quietly engaged the safety, lifted his head, and looked toward the distant mountains instead of the crowd gathering behind him. It was almost as though the successful shot mattered less to him than the changing wind already beginning another conversation across the valley. At that exact moment, inside the secure ballistic monitoring center several miles away, warning indicators illuminated across multiple tracking consoles simultaneously. Independent radar systems confirmed the recorded trajectory. Acoustic sensors verified the event. Optical tracking completed the final confirmation. Every monitor displayed the same impossible conclusion. The supervising officer stared silently at the glowing data before lifting the secure telephone with steady hands. "Notify base operations immediately," he said. "The protected evaluation corridor has just recorded an unscheduled long-range event. Begin identification of the shooter." Across Echo Range, no one yet realized that Thomas Walker's single quiet shot had already begun traveling through a very different chain of command, one that would soon bring someone from his distant past back into his life. The faint metallic echo faded into the vast desert until only silence remained. No applause followed. No voices broke the stillness. Every Marine on Echo Range seemed frozen between disbelief and curiosity, each one searching for an explanation that refused to appear. Sergeant Ethan Brooks slowly lowered his binoculars and looked toward the weathered orange rifle resting quietly in Thomas Walker's hands. The confidence that had shaped every word he spoke earlier that afternoon had disappeared. In its place stood honest uncertainty. Thomas calmly opened the bolt, inspected the empty chamber, and engaged the safety before laying the rifle gently across the shooting mat. His movements carried no trace of triumph. To him, the remarkable shot seemed no more important than carefully placing the rifle back onto the worn canvas beneath the afternoon sun. Ryan Cole continued staring toward the distant impact plate through his spotting scope, almost expecting it to reveal another answer hidden somewhere beyond the shimmering heat. Instead, he found himself watching Thomas. The old veteran had already begun folding the faded cloth ribbon and placing it back inside the worn leather pouch beside the notebook. It was as though the entire challenge had already become another ordinary memory before anyone else had finished understanding what had happened. Several Marines quietly approached the shooting lane without speaking. One instructor checked the electronic weather stations again, comparing every recorded value against the measured trajectory. Nothing matched the outcome they had just witnessed. Brooks finally stepped closer to Thomas. "I honestly believe that could not be done," he admitted quietly. Thomas looked toward the distant mountains rather than the crowd gathering around him. "The mountains decide what can be done," he answered softly. "We only decide whether we are patient enough to listen." Ryan lowered his spotting scope completely. Those simple words settled more deeply than any technical explanation could have. Inside the secure ballistic monitoring center, however, patience had already given way to urgency. The supervising officer stood beside the main operations display while technicians completed one independent verification after another. Every system continued confirming the same extraordinary result. Radar tracking matched the optical record. Acoustic sensors aligned perfectly with the computed trajectory. Nothing suggested equipment failure. One analyst enlarged the digital map until the crimson flight path stretched across the entire display. "Origin confirmed," she reported. "Echo Range." Another technician finished searching the days. "Authorized training schedule." No scheduled event entered the protected evaluation corridor. The supervising officer nodded once before issuing another instruction. "Identify the individual assigned to that firing lane." Base operations transmitted the range log within seconds. Several names appeared on the screen before the temporary visitor entry drew immediate attention. "Thomas Walker," one communications specialist read aloud. The room became noticeably quieter. The supervisor repeated the name thoughtfully. "Search archived military records." The primary personnel database returned only limited public information, but an older historical archive continued searching far longer than expected. After several tense seconds, multiple restricted files appeared together beneath Thomas Walker's service record. The analyst studying the screen leaned closer. "Sir," she said carefully, "this profile contains restricted historical authorizations. Open the service summary." The analyst hesitated only briefly before reading silently through the first page. Her expression changed almost immediately. "This requires command-level access." Without another word, the supervisor reached for a second secure telephone connected directly to headquarters. Outside, the desert remained peaceful. Brooks watched Thomas carefully close the leather notebook before placing it beside the orange rifle. There was still no pride in the veteran's expression, only the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent an entire lifetime trusting experience instead of recognition. Suddenly, several radios carried by range personnel crackled almost at the same moment. A captain answered one transmission, listened silently, then looked toward the administration building with unmistakable surprise. Another officer received a similar call and immediately straightened his posture. Government vehicles began moving near the operations offices while additional personnel stepped outside, scanning the firing line before speaking in a handheld radios. Brooks noticed the unusual activity and turned toward Ryan. "What is happening?" Ryan watched another command vehicle appear in the distance, its dark outline growing larger beneath the afternoon sun. "I do not think they are responding to the shot," he said quietly. "I think they are responding to the man who fired it." The distant growl of approaching engines rolled gently across Echo Range long before anyone could see the vehicles themselves. Heads turned almost in unison toward the entrance road where a thin cloud of desert dust slowly climbed into the afternoon sky. Government sport utility vehicles emerged one after another, moving with calm purpose rather than urgency. Every Marine instinctively sensed that something unusual was happening. Conversations disappeared. Boots shifted into position. Radios crackled briefly before falling silent again. Sergeant Ethan Brooks looked toward the approaching convoy, then back at Thomas Walker, who remained completely unconcerned. The elderly veteran simply placed the folded cloth ribbon into the worn leather pouch, closed the notebook, and carefully wiped a final trace of dust from the orange rifle before returning it to the weathered case. Ryan Cole noticed the remarkable contrast. While everyone else searched for answers, Thomas behaved exactly as though another ordinary afternoon had reached its natural conclusion. The lead vehicle came to a smooth stop near the firing line. A senior officer stepped out first, followed by several aides who immediately moved aside without saying a word. Then the rear passenger door opened. General Richard Hayes emerged slowly, adjusting his service cap beneath the bright western sunlight before lifting his eyes toward the firing positions. The captain overseeing the range immediately called the Marines to attention. The crisp movement echoed across the gravel as every uniformed Marine stood perfectly still. Brooks felt his pulse quicken. A four-star general did not leave headquarters in the middle of the day without extraordinary reason. General Hayes acknowledged the formation with a brief nod, but he did not stop to receive reports. Instead, he walked directly toward the elderly man standing beside the faded orange rifle case. Every step appeared measured, almost deliberate, as though he already knew exactly whom he had come to meet. Thomas looked up calmly as the general approached within only a few feet. Neither man spoke. The silence stretched long enough for everyone watching to feel the weight of years passing between them. Ryan noticed something subtle in the general's expression. It was not curiosity. It was recognition. Then, without hesitation or announcement, General Hayes raised his right hand in a slow, flawless salute. The movement carried complete respect rather than ceremony. An almost invisible wave of surprise passed through the Marines standing at attention. Ethan Brooks stared in disbelief. Throughout his career, he had witnessed countless salutes directed toward commanding officers, distinguished visitors, and decorated leaders, but he had never imagined watching a four-star general salute an elderly civilian carrying an old orange rifle. Thomas looked quietly into the general's eyes before returning the salute with the same calm dignity that had defined every action he had taken throughout the afternoon. When both hands lowered, a warm smile crossed General Hayes's face. "Sergeant Walker," he said softly, "I had hoped our paths would cross again someday." Thomas answered with a gentle nod. "It has been a long time, General." Hayes glanced toward the orange rifle resting inside the open case before looking across the silent Marines gathered around them. "Many years ago," he said, "before any of you standing here wore this uniform, I was a young captain assigned to learn long-range field observation from one of the finest instructors I ever served beside." Brooks looked slowly from the general back to Thomas, struggling to understand what he was hearing. Hayes rested one hand lightly against the weathered rifle case. Most people see faded paint, he continued. I see a rifle that earned every mark honestly, and the man who carried it with quiet professionalism when recognition mattered least. Nobody on the range moved. The desert wind drifted softly through the range flags while the distant mountains remained silent beyond the shimmering afternoon heat. Brooks realized that the extraordinary shot had not truly brought the general there. It had simply reminded the military that one of its quietest legends had returned. The silence that settled across Echo Range seemed deeper than anything the desert wind could carry. General Richard Hayes looked slowly from the weathered orange rifle to the rows of Marines standing at attention before speaking again, his calm voice reaching every person on the firing line without needing to rise. Many people believe precision begins with equipment, he said. The finest instructors I ever knew taught something different. They taught that precision begins with patience, observation, and humility. Sergeant Thomas Walker spent his career proving that lesson every single day. The general turned toward the gathered Marines. The remarkable shot all of you witnessed today is impressive, but it is not why I came here. I came because our monitoring systems reminded us that a man who quietly shaped generations of military professionals was standing on this range once again. Ethan Brooks lowered his eyes briefly, replaying every careless joke he had made only an hour earlier. The confidence that had once filled him had not disappeared. It had simply been replaced by understanding. He stepped forward until he stood directly in front of Thomas Walker. Every Marine watched in complete silence. Sir, Brooks said sincerely, I judged you before I knew who you were. I believed modern equipment meant experience no longer mattered. I was wrong, and I owe you an apology. Thomas looked at the young sergeant with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the afternoon. After a quiet moment, a gentle smile appeared beneath the lines of his weathered face. Then today has already been worthwhile, he answered. Never apologize for being confident. Only remember to leave room for someone who has already walked the road you are beginning. Brooks nodded slowly, carrying those words more carefully than any formal lesson he had received during training. Ryan Cole quietly folded his spotting scope and looked once more toward the distant mountains where the nearly invisible impact plate rested beneath the afternoon sunlight. The target suddenly seemed far less important than the conversation taking place beside him. General Hayes stepped closer to the weathered rifle case and rested one hand lightly upon its edge. Do you still keep it exactly as it was? He asked. Thomas nodded. Every mark belongs there. The general smiled. I hoped you would say that. Together they looked at the faded orange stock, its worn finish carrying the quiet evidence of decades that no display case or polished replacement could ever reproduce. Thomas gently lifted the rifle, placed it back inside the weathered case, and carefully secured each metal latch with familiar hands. There was no celebration waiting for him, no ceremony, no speeches prepared in advance. None of those things had ever been the reason he came to Echo Range. He simply picked up the old rifle case and turned toward the small pickup truck waiting where he had parked earlier that afternoon. The Marines instinctively remained at attention as he began walking away. No command had been given. No officer instructed them to remain still. Respect alone held every person in place. The warm desert breeze carried the faint sound of fluttering range flags while long evening shadows stretched quietly across the gravel. Before climbing into the truck, Thomas paused for one final glance toward the mountains, then offered a small nod to General Hayes and the young Marines who would continue serving long after he was gone. The engine started softly. The pickup rolled down the dusty access road until it disappeared beyond the last ridge beneath the golden evening sky. Only after the truck vanished from sight did General Hayes quietly lower his salute. Brooks continued watching the empty road, understanding that some lessons arrive through textbooks, some through technology, but the ones remembered for a lifetime almost always arrive through people who never asked to be remembered. Echo Range gradually returned to its ordinary routine, yet nothing truly remained the same. Long after the equipment was packed away and the desert became quiet once more, the story of one elderly veteran, one weathered orange rifle, and one unforgettable afternoon continued traveling farther than any remarkable shot ever could, reminding every Marine who witnessed it that respect is never demanded. It is quietly earned, faithfully carried, and never forgotten.